Hello everyone, my name is Tom Denton and I will be discussing the films from the 1970s all the way through the 2000s. Starting in the 1970s, we saw a rise of what they called the New Hollywood and the rise of the auteur. The reason it had this title was because for the first time, directors and filmmakers started having much more input in what they were making on this. We saw this in horror movies such as The Exorcist and Halloween. We saw it in really gritty war films like Apocalypse Now and MASH, disenfranchisement, human dramas like Taxi Driver and The Deer Hunter. There were also violent crime films like Father and A Clockwork Orange. And then towards the end of the decade, we saw the rise of the blockbuster, starting with Steven Spielberg's Jaws, and then one of the biggest blockbusters of all time, Star Wars. Now, some of the notable filmmakers to come out of this era were Martin Scorsese for his films like Taxi Driver. On another side of the coin, we saw Francis Ford Coppola, who made a big splash with The Godfather. Had incredible lead performances from Al Pacino and, of course, Marlon Brando. Francis Ford Coppola would also go on in the same decade to make Apocalypse Now, which is considered one of the greatest war films of all time, with another great performance from Marlon Brando. This decade also saw the rise of filmmakers like Robert Altman. Michael Cimino was one of the great filmmakers of the decade. But towards the end of this era, like I mentioned earlier, we saw the rise of the blockbuster. This started with Steven Spielberg's Jaws. And then, of course, we saw Star Wars, which was George Lucas's major task. So what really happened in this era? Again, at the beginning of the decade, the studios were giving all of the power to the filmmakers, and the filmmakers were making deeply personal, important films. We saw Taxi Driver, Apocalypse Now, The Godfather, The Deer Hunter, all of these films. But when Heaven's Gate came out, that kind of killed everything because it was so wildly over budget and it almost bankrupted the studio. So they stopped giving all of these directors and upcoming directors the power and influence and the ability to make the movies that they made. But this was also, like I said, the time that Jaws and Star Wars came out. So we started seeing the rise of more action-oriented film and more science fiction films, which brings us to the 1980s. We saw a massive rise in sci-fi, action, comedy, and of course, the franchise. Adventure films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Back to the Future are all still extremely iconic. We also have sci-fi movies like Aliens, The Terminator, Blade Runner, which came out in the decade, and then the franchises. Star Wars, we know today, they're still making Star Wars movies 40 years later. Indiana Jones, there were 3 movies in the 80s and 90s, and they're making a new one literally today. But we also saw the rise of the teen dramedy in the 80s, and this was from John Hughes films like The Breakfast Club, but there was also Stand By Me, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and these were movies that were deeply personal for teenagers. Some of the notable filmmakers out of this age, again, we had George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, but we also, like I said, saw the John Hughes movies, the deeply kind of personal but funny, engaging teen dramedies. So in the 90s, we saw the rise of independent filmmakers and the major domination of Disney, and of course, the use of CGI in film. Now, when it comes to independent filmmakers, there were a lot of great young filmmakers who got their big breaks in the 90s, starting with somebody like Quentin Tarantino, who made a huge splash with his film Pulp Fiction, which, again, super iconic. We also saw people like David Fincher with Fight Club and Seven. People like Wes Anderson came out. And Richard Linklater had a massive success with his really, really small indie budget film, Dazed and Confused. We also have Disney, which came out with some massive films of the time. I remember going to see The Lion King, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast in the theaters and being deeply moved by these films when I was a kid. Disney's massive expansion into the Pixar universe with the help of Steve Jobs was also around this point, and they made the first movie ever made completely with computer graphics, which was Toy Story. And we know that this is another franchise that continues to this day. Within just the last few years, we saw Toy Story 4. But we also saw the CGI incorporate into actual films and show us worlds that we couldn't see otherwise. And of course, there was The Matrix. So that does it for my portion. I sure hope you enjoyed it.